because I've been your student in a way, in the sense that I've read your book and I've analyzed your book, one of your books, and it's been a great influence on me the past decade. Um, as we welcome Dr. Deuze, just a small introduction of him will not do justice to his entire body of work, but he's the professor of media studies specializing in journalism at the University of Amsterdam in the Netherlands. He's been a journalist in South Africa and the Netherlands. He's been a Fulbright scholar, a research fellow at the University of Leeds in the UK, and of course, a celebrated author of books on the media. He's also a self-confessed musician. Maybe on another bass guitar, and maybe we should do both. Playing bass guitar while he's talking about media and zombies and all that kind of stuff as well. But that's the day. Dr. Deuze has written several books on the media work, media life beyond journalism, and journalism in the Netherlands. But I'm particularly interested in his work on media life. That's the book that I studied as a PhD student, and grew especially interested in how he problematizes the modern world of media and social media, its production and consumption, which is constantly going on together, and how we are both producers and consumers. One strand of interpretation of media literacy actually has roots in the thought in Mark's book. So, Mark, welcome, and I really want to thank you for taking the time to do this for our students as we begin a kind of a journey from media illiteracy to media literacy. It's an honor to have you.
Thank you so much, Professor.
So my questions would kind of be broad, and then we will clearly get an understanding of them as we go along. And this is going to be a kind of an unusual interview in that the words we are going to use are not usually used in academia, such as zombies. But to begin with, in your book, Media Life, you say that we all presume to live in a media-centric world. It's a presumption. First of all, do you believe that we are living in a media-centric world? That is, we are the center of the media, as well as the media is the center of our world. Is that how you meant it, or do you think that it's still just an illusion or a presumption? How do you interpret that for us?
Well, first of all, thanks for your very, very kind words, and I'm very happy to be here and to share some thoughts with you. The central idea behind Media Life as a book, but generally in all my teaching and research, is very much this notion that we live in media, which, as you say, is sort of a media-centric way of looking at the world. And what I mean with that is quite literal, because if you say that you live with media, right, that media is just one element of lots of other things that happen in your life. What you're actually saying is that you can also live without, that you can switch them off, that you can ignore them or bypass them or not really need them at all. And I think that is actually the illusion. That media in all their different manifestations, from the movies we watch to the music we hear to the devices that we keep close to ourselves to the relationships we establish via these media, all of that really produces our world. And we become better at dealing with that if we acknowledge that. If we still maintain this illusion that we can do without them, we're actually in a worse place to be able to deal with it.
Yeah, so therefore the illusion is not that we are living in it, but the illusion is that we can also live without it. That is the actual illusion that really we're talking about. And that's very interesting, because that means that, like it or not, the media is influencing me every minute of my, at least my living time. Yes. In what ways do you think that's happening?
Well, in lots of different ways. And look, this I would say that the position that I'm advocating is perhaps not so much a media-centric, but a media-centered one. Now, that may sound like nitty-picking, but I do think there's a real difference here, because a media-centric idea of this influence that you talk about suggests that media do stuff with us, right? That when we see something on television, when we get a message, it produces some kind of behavior in us. And I think that's too strongly put. There is not enough evidence to support that kind of conclusion. But a media-centered approach is more subtle. It suggests that we cannot act in the world anymore without recognizing that media play a role in it. But it's not that media program us to do things in a certain way. So the influence of media is always a two-way influence. When we use media, we influence media as much as they influence us. What this position helps us to do is to take responsibility for what we do in media, because everything we do has consequences. Every retweet, everything we like or favorite, every message we send has consequences, both for other people as well as for the technologies we use. Because today, in a digital environment, every action we make with media is used to train software or interfaces and hardware to be different, to be better, to develop, to accommodate our wishes and our needs. So that's the key argument here. So this influence that media has on us, I would say, works primarily in 2 or 3 different ways. I mean, the main way I would say is, of course, through the content of the messages that we receive, to, again, the movies we watch or the music we listen to, or the message we get, the apps that we get, the emails that we get, and those kind of things. Of course, that's a direct influence in there, that we get content, and that content makes us feel certain things, makes us want to think about certain things, makes us respond to certain things. There's also a type of influence that has more to do with the technology itself. Like, if we use Facebook or Instagram or TikTok, these services have specific kinds of interfaces. They allow us to do certain things and not other things, right? You can like and favorite something, but you cannot dislike something, for example. And that's a very minute limitation of the interface. But in fact, every interface, every device we use has hundreds of limitations of things they really don't want us to do with them. Right. And so in that way, they influence us, they structure our behavior, they nudge us into certain directions all the time. And those are the 2 key influences, I would say, that media have on us.
So media as technology, as well as media, the content of media, in 2 ways, except that if you talk about even the technology, well, I mean, it's easy to see how we control the content or somebody else is controlling the content, because in any case, on the social media, for example, like you said, the algorithms make sure that there is some control of content from our side, and we have that kind of an illusion of being in control. However, you said that, I mean, I just want to clarify it, that even when it comes to the technology, it's not the technology that's in control, it's the people behind the technology.
Yes, and I think it's important for us to realize that there's I guess, for lack of a better term, I would call there's a feedback loop in this. What do I mean with that is that, let's say you use a smartphone, right? You have a smartphone in your pocket, you take it out and you use it for sending a text or watching a video or playing a game, whatever. So at that moment, when you use that device, there's a feedback loop that involves 3 or 4 elements. It's you who is at the device swiping away, right? It's the interface of whatever app you're using. That could be Facebook or TikTok or YouTube or any of those apps. It's the technology of the phone, this black box that most of us don't really understand how it works, but it works. And then there's, as you so correctly remark, the people behind it who've made and designed and made that phone and who have programmed that app. And there's a constant feedback loop, meaning that we're in a relationship with each other, but that is constantly changing. So and the way you can notice that is try to keep tabs on how many times you have to download updated versions of the apps you use on your phone. What that means is that these apps constantly change because they are being adapted based on what we do with them. And of course, also with how this phone itself evolves as a technology. So that's what I mean with a feedback loop. It's too simple to just say, well, that app is influencing me, or the programmers of that app are forcing me to do certain things. That's partly true. But what is also true is by using this app in a certain way, you are influencing the app and the programmers back. And it's important to think of things in those types of relationships.
Right. Which brings me very nicely to the next question, I think. Is mutual surveillance different from what you're saying right now? That's what you say in your book. The term you use is actually that there is mutual surveillance. And I presume that you mean between me and, I don't know, the technology, is it? Or what are we really talking about?
Well, I mean, and you hear this a lot, right? This comment that we live in a surveillance society today. And generally when we hear that, we think that means that we are being watched. We are being monitored by some unseen entity. You know, in the past we would call that Big Brother, or you can call it Mark Zuckerberg at Facebook, or the government, or, you know, companies. It's some unknown entity that's sort of keeping track of us. And next to that kind of surveillance, we have another type of surveillance where we watch those companies and the state back. For example, by leaving reviews of the restaurants we visit, or the concert venues we go to, or the games we play, right? We give them stars, or we write little comments. Or on social media, we complain about what the government is doing or not doing. And all of that are ways for us to survey, you know, the few elements in our society that act upon us, right? The state and also on. Now, then there's a third form of surveillance that I think we don't talk about enough, and that's, as you say, it is a form of mutual surveillance. In the book, I call this omnoptic surveillance as well. It's the notion that everyone and everything is watching everyone else. Right. And what that means, it's again an attempt that I'm making in the book is to make us realize that yes, media are everywhere, and yes, they influence us, but we are not without power. We are not without agency. We have a responsibility in this. Surveillance is not something that is just done to us. We do it to each other as well. For example, if you're in a classroom, almost everyone around you has a device in their pocket. I think I have one too. That is the most sophisticated surveillance device in the history of the world, right? We can take high definition video of each other. We can tag each other on posts. We can, the device locates us where we are at all times, and links with other devices in the vicinity without us seeing it. So surveillance is really something we all participate in when we share simple things about our lives, what we had for breakfast, who we are dating, how much fun we had last night. When we post those kind of things on our social media profiles, we are actually contributing to a surveillance, to a system of mutual surveillance about ourselves, about the people we care about, and of course about the companies whose services we use.
And the consent to be surveilled without.
Yeah, and that's a two-sided sword as well, because to some extent we agree to participate in surveillance society by signing end user agreements when every time when Facebook or whatever says, do you still agree with the terms of service? We say, yes, 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 because I want to use the device. But a lot of this surveillance is also done without us really knowing it. Consider, for example, the fastest growing type of communication in the world, which is machine-to-machine communication. In other words, is these devices talking with each other about us. And that's the kind of surveillance that we don't really see, right? And there's no human being involved with it anymore, but it's still very much happening, and it becomes an increasingly powerful agent in our lives. When, as you said earlier, algorithms that use the data gathered from surveying us to decide whether we get access to a plane, whether we may enter a building or not, whether we can buy a certain product, whether we can get a mortgage or not, right? Those decisions are increasingly made not by human beings, but by algorithms, and the algorithms base their decisions on surveillance. So that's why it's so important to think about surveillance, not just as it's done to you, but also in how you do it to everything and everyone else.
So it's important that we are kind of conscious of the fact that we are constantly both being surveilled, if that's a word, Americans use it. I think it's surveyed really.
Right, yes.
And that we are also surveying other people. And therefore, and complicating that is the fact that we live in a media world. I mean, or media life. It's constant. It's yes. Both constant as well as it's almost automatic. That to me, that brings us to the question of zombies. My favorite word in your book. So you said, like zombies, we lose our sense of ego and individuality as we are collectively lost in our technologies. Right?
Yes.
That struck me. Are we in a zombie state? I mean, you're calling us zombies? I mean, is that what you're doing? I mean, are we in a zombie state of hypnosis or, generally under the illusion that we are active? What do you mean by that?
Well, thank you for asking about this, because it's arguably the favorite part of my book, but it's also the part where I get the most sort of questions about or comments on. And let me be very clear. I use zombies in the book also to have a little bit of fun, right? You cannot be an academic without also having a little bit of fun. But I think it's a very evocative, very productive concept, because when I say zombie, everybody have an image in their heads. They have some kind of association with it. So it's a powerful rhetorical device. Now, are we all becoming zombies because we live in media? And you could argue, yes, we are. If you define zombie as an entity that is neither alive or dead, it's something in between. It's a mix of things. And it's that mix, that undetermined mix, that makes the zombie so powerful and also a little bit scary, right? You cannot kill it.
Yes.
Now, how does that apply to our lives in media? Well, you could argue that if we live in media, if our relationship with our technologies has become so intimate that we cannot separate ourselves from them anymore, are we then still completely human? Are we not also, to some extent, machines? Are our lives simply determined by the flesh on our body and the thoughts in our head, or are they also determined by the digital version of us that lives in countless databases that determine to some extent what kind of decisions we can and cannot make? The answer to those questions must be, well, it's a bit of both. And the moment you accept that is the moment you have to let go of notions that I am a complete human, or I'm just a machine, I am a physical being, or I have a digital persona. Well, you are both at the same time. Ergo, you are a zombie. Now, when people think of zombies, they generally think of these things in negative terms, right? Zombies cannot think for themselves. They just go around, and they're like stupid, right? And in the book, I'm trying to, like I said, have a little bit of fun of it and turn it around and said, well, but could zombies be a positive thing too? For example, in your question, you rightfully say, we don't have an ego, right? I mean, we have lost our individuality. And I would argue, perhaps to some extent, this can be a good thing, in the sense that if we are all zombies and we all live in media, the best way to think about that is to think in terms of things that we share, that we have in common, that we live in a world where we're all connected, whether you are in India, in Bangalore, or in Amsterdam, the Netherlands, or in Venezuela, or in Australia. We are all connected in this media environment. We can all witness each other's lives. We know about the protests in the United States and the ecological disaster in Australia, right? We can follow each other's trauma. And that helps us, hopefully, to take shared responsibility for each other and for our planet. So that's an optimistic reading of that. And a final thought about, that maybe some people would, when they listen to this, think, but wait a minute, I'm still an individual. A funny exercise that I can give you to show you that we're not individuals anymore is if people start comparing their social media profiles. So whether you have a TikTok or an Instagram or a YouTube channel or a Facebook account or any of those, and you take, if, for example, in a classroom, 5 or 10 students that would compare their profiles. And what you'll find is that while you've been posting on your profile very intimate, personal, individual, unique details, if you put all of those profiles together, you see actually that everybody's posting more or less the same things. And that generally means that the uniqueness that we think we have actually dissolves into this sort of blob, if you will, where everybody has more or less the same kind of life, shares more or less the same kind of updates, with more or less the same kind of stories and storylines and characters. And that's a funny little exercise to me that I sometimes do with my students, that makes us aware that all this individuality that we think we possess actually becomes less specific when we combine it with all the individualities of the people around us, which I then use as an argument to say, well, maybe we're not all that different. Maybe to focus on those differences is actually what keeps us from taking responsibility. We should be focusing on what we share, what we have in common, and media helps us doing that.
That obviously also means that we've never really been individual. It's more a realization now that I'm not individual enough, that I have so many people that I agree with, and therefore I have to like their posts because they're thinking exactly like me, right? Or that there's all these echo chambers that we're going to talk about in this class as well, that that I actually conform to, and therefore I'm not that individualistic eventually. So it's a little bit of a realization as well. My final question to you, Mark, would be a little more on the media literacy side, which I believe is that, is it necessary for us to know all this? Do you think that the public really needs to know that, for example, that there are zombies, or that there is mutual surveillance, or of course, whether our data is being collected and whether it matters that much to me? After all, I'm sharing all the data that's being collected.
Right.
Do you think that media literacy is actually needed?
Well, I think to a large extent people already do know, or they feel it. They feel that their relationship with media is beyond control. I'm not saying we should be in control of it. Maybe we should, maybe we shouldn't. That's a different debate. But everybody kind of senses that their relationship to this device, or to the music they love, or the movies they love, is quite intimate, and to some extent perhaps even problematically so. So that's something we know, and that the fact that our data is gathered, that when we go online, that machines are watching, is pretty widespread sort of knowledge. The thing
Really.
is, therefore, not so much knowing about this, but understanding what we can do about it. And those are two very different things, right? I mean, one approach to media literacy is just simply telling people all the different ways in which, for example, surveillance works, or all the different ways in which this device is both providing you a lot of fun and entertainment, but also taking things from you, right? Or how advertising or commerce works very subtly in children's programming, or all those kind of things. That's to know about that is one thing, but that's very different from being able to do something with it. And to think of this device as not something you use as a consumer, but as a producer, as a maker, as somebody that can create rather than simply consume. And I think that's where the real challenge for media literacy is to shift from imparting knowledge, which to some extent is important, but also taps into knowledge that people generally already have. There's a lot of common sense stuff about involved in all of this. But the more complicated part is what you can do with this knowledge.
Dr. Mark Deuze, it's it was an honor to meet you, electronically, but now it's such a pleasure to have talked with you for 26 minutes now, and having shared the kind of insight that only you could have provided, because it's so different, so radical, and yet very, very important for us. I think this has been an enlightening session for all of us. Thank you very much for being here, and thank you very much for your time.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciated you reaching out. Thank you so much.